Good afternoon to everyone who is joining us for the Garden Design with Soil Building in Mind webinar. Due to COVID-19 pandemic, our strategies to work with producers has been impacted. It has resulted to virtual webinars lasting 8 months now. However, our presenter today will share a wealth of information from not only experience, but her passion for gardening. She has been a partner to the Native American Producer Success Project on many educational and outreach workshops. Before I give Carole the time to present, I would like to provide you a summary of our project. The Arizona Native American Producer Success Project 7 is a collaborative effort between Developing Innovations in Navajo Education, New Mexico Cooperative Extension Service, Diné College Land Grants Office. The project is funded by USDA's Office of Partnership and Public Engagement, Outreach and Assistance for Socially Disadvantaged Veteran Farmers and Ranchers Program. The goal of the Arizona NAP 7 project is to increase the profitability and long-term sustainability of Navajo farmers and ranchers. To achieve this goal, activities in 4 key areas are being undertaken: to improve Navajo farm and ranch operations, to increase Navajo farmer and rancher knowledge of and access to available programs and technical assistance provided by the United States Department of Agriculture, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Navajo Nation, the New Mexico Cooperative Extension Service, the Diné College Land Grants Office, and others, to facilitate Navajo farmer and rancher use of USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service, Farm Service Agency, and Risk Management Agency programs, to strengthen the organizational capacity of the Navajo Farmer and Rancher Congress to address the current and future needs of the Navajo farmers and ranchers. So I am going to give Carole the floor to begin her presentation.
I started with this one because I feel like in this time of COVID that, this is a flashback to many years ago, but just the idea that some of us are spending a lot of time just with ourselves. And so I always like to put a little humor into these. And then the other thing I wanted to say about this presentation is that some of this is based on presentations that I've done in the past where I did not have the photo credits. So I tried to put in credits for things as I was going along and revising it for today. But if anybody that might see this on Facebook or on the web or something sees a photo that wasn't credited that needs to be credited, just please let us know. So that's just something that I think. Okay, so garden design with soil strategies in mind. We'll start with introducing myself as best I can in Navajo. Carole Palmer Yinishe, Irish Nishli, Swedish Bashashin, Scottish Dashche, Beshbachai Dashanala. So I'm not Navajo, but as Sadie said, I have been working with the NAPS team for a number of years, and I really appreciate this opportunity to work with everybody for this webinar, because this is something that there's a ton of information out there, but I think we can look at it for our local region. What are things to consider and how can we look at this? So this photo is actually from my garden here at my house, from one of my gardens. I have a bunch of little spaces that I'm working with rather than a big field. So the top row is a lasagna strategy that we'll talk about later on. And then the photo is from this past spring. But I also wanted to acknowledge that this time of year, October, this is not a normal time for a lot of people to think about gardening or any of those things. This is really the Navajo New Year. It's the winter ceremony season, which has been altered by our current circumstances with COVID. But the idea of abundance coming through good planning and patience. So again, with this being the beginning of the new year, I think it's a really great time to reflect and prepare and to acknowledge that whole cycle that we are constantly, we forget about it in the Western ways. And I feel like it's something that's really valuable to remember. So, if anybody can say that top line, I don't want to butcher it. I think I could pronounce it, but again, maybe somebody else could do that. But again, bringing that back in, because I feel with these discussions, we don't really, uh, the Western way just gets pushed to the front too much. But for gardeners and farmers, this is a time to reflect as well in thinking and planning and preparing for the next growing season. So it's often called putting the garden to bed. And that's not something that people really think about in that way. So I thought this was funny. And I know the newsletter is going to have a little bit of information about this as well. What does that even mean, putting your garden to bed? What do you want to do? So the idea of cutting back dead plants, protecting your perennial plants, the ones that come back year after year, and that's your trees, your bushes, rose bushes. You want to give them some winter protection. Look at any fencing, irrigation, what needs to be repaired. Drain your hoses, store them away. Don't just leave them flopping around in the sun. Repairing and putting tools away. And then deciding on what strategy you'll use. And can you start thinking about how you will implement that and what you can be doing over the next several months towards next year? So one thing I wanted to say, because when people get some shears in their hands, they might want to just cut back a lot of things, but you really only want to cut back things that are dead, because when you make a cut, it stimulates the growth of the plant, and it's getting cold now, and you don't want that, because that could freeze the plant and cause injury. Plus, it won't be able to heal itself because it's going to sleep, it's going to bed for the winter. So fruit trees and other trees and shrubs that need to be pruned, unless there's a broken branch or something that really is definitely dead, you want to wait until next spring for that part. So I just wanted to make a note of that, because sometimes people will just get all excited. But why are we doing this now, the cleanup? Well, for one is to eliminate the pests and any diseases that might have occurred. If you had some challenges with your garden or with your field, you want to clean up anything that could keep that disease in place, and then review what worked. Again, reflect on what did not work, so that you can think about how to make a plan for the coming year while you still remember. I don't know about you guys, but I always think I'm going to remember things and then I don't. If we're more conscious and more in the moment, and again, as previous webinars have discussed record keeping and all of those good things, these are always things that we should be working toward and aspiring to. But for me especially, one of the reasons that I like to do things now is because the weather is really perfect. It's not too hot, it's not too cold. And when spring comes around, if I put something off and if I think, I don't want to feel like doing it right now. And if I wait till spring, it's too windy in the spring. And so then it's hard for me to get out there and do some things. So I think this is really an ideal time to do some things, so that when next spring comes around, you can just jump into it. And it doesn't take as much time, because you're already letting the garden do work for you during the winter months. I mentioned that, design, and so these are the times to think about too. Well, maybe I just did a basic garden this year, but what would be fun to do, or what would be different to do? I think everybody needs to be more creative and to find things to inspire them. We're all getting a little bit fatigued by everything that we've been through. It's been such a roller coaster, and gardens are very therapeutic. So if you had a garden this year, did you think about having a salsa garden, or what they call a pizza garden, where you're growing the different plants that you can use for ingredients for those things? This was from a school garden design. But I think it's funny, it has dad's garlic bed and then mom's hops trellises. So hops is used to make beer, and I'm like, well, maybe mom needs the beer more than dad does. I don't know. I just thought that was kind of funny. But then this was just another one. Again, these are for larger scale gardens, not necessarily for home gardens, but that doesn't mean you couldn't achieve something on a smaller scale. Or maybe you're working with your chapter, or maybe you've got some ideas for the senior center, or for the Head Start, or for another community garden area, and you could start thinking about, well, what would that look like? What could we do? And then this one's even fancier, but it has the big field at the other end. And so, again, a lot of people still do like to have their field area, and you can have the field and have the smaller gardens and really do a lot of cool things. This one was for a public garden. It's a concept. So again, now is the time to really just think and dream and play as you're doing your work to put your garden to bed. So wanted to mention this. There is an app for that. There's always, everything now is getting really more online and in the cloud. So you can actually do garden design on the computer if you're so inclined. And this is something that I started doing. So that little sample design down in the right-hand corner is one that I put together based on that program. And so it's just, it was something that I came across, and I don't get into it a whole lot, but in the winter, in December and January, when there's nothing you can do outside, it was really fun to be able to play around with this and think about what I might do in that way. So this is the east end of my house. I just moved into this location 3 years ago, 2017. And so it's just, it was not really landscaped, and there was stuff that was done by the previous people, but so I've had to undo some things. But the back of the house, it just had this dirt slope going down. So I was like, well, that's not good. But it's the east end of the house, and it's really protected from the wind. The wind in our region usually comes from the south and the west a lot of times of the year. And so this is kind of prime real estate as far as anything to do with a garden. So I was like, I need to do something here. So I started thinking about it. And if you can see up in the upper left-hand corner, there's one of my dogs, that's Boots. She's always wanting to consult, but you can get a sense of how that hillside just kind of dips down, but it's not real big. So what I decided to do was some kind of a terrace, again, thinking about how the land is and how I can work with it instead of fighting it. And so that's where it looks today after-ish, because it's always still a work in progress. But you can see I have a lot of cleanup I need to do, and I'm nowhere near finishing this project. It's going to be ongoing, and that's just something that we always, I think anybody that has a farm, has a garden, you're always working on it, making improvements, doing different things, trying different strategies. But all those rocks were here on my property, and I just rearranged them and moved them. So it was definitely a process to get that going. But now I've made use of that hillside, and I made it into a 2-level terrace. And I did use the method we're going to talk about in order to do that. And you can't really tell because everything is getting kind of brown, but I used pine needles as a mulch. And this picture was actually taken just this morning. So this was the design, going back to that. And it doesn't have, like, I thought I would grow some certain things. I thought I would get some cabbage going and some broccoli and all that sort of thing, but I haven't quite gotten to that yet as far as being successful with it. Everything that I did plant this spring, the wind and the cold got to before it got established. So and then with COVID, I kind of stepped out. But there are other things I want to do, and there's another fence that I want to plant things on. So again, always thinking. But one of the ways that I really have found that help me enjoy it even more is looking at what I can grow that's going to just keep coming back. So again, these pictures are just from today. It's October 23rd. And so on the left, you see these pink flowers and some other things. And there's, You can kind of see the purple. There's lavender, and the pink is called dianthus. It's a kind of a carnation. And they sell it at Home Depot and Walmart in the spring and in the summer, and they call it an annual. But really, if it likes where it is, it will continue to grow. And it's hardy to the cold. So the coldest it's gotten here so far, I'm at about 7,000 feet where I am. And it's, let's see, it got down to 34, I think is all so far. So I haven't really had a freeze yet, like other places have. But these plants that you see, they can all tolerate that. They're considered zone 3 perennials, and we're in zone 5, 6 in this region mostly. And so 3 can take colder weather. So they're still looking good, and that makes me happy. And down in the other corner, there's some chives and some onions and things. And I love planting onions and chives because they keep coming back, and they're the first things to get green in the spring, and they like the cold weather. So those are things that help me keep inspired. And you can't see them, but I also put strawberries in that top bed because, again, it's protected from the wind. So those strawberries haven't produced yet, but they're there. So the reason, again, to do the perennial plants where you can is that it reminds you to keep some things in the ground. So this is just a little overview I found relating to cleaning up, but the idea that you don't have to just blade everything and have it be bare. You want to keep the ground covered, but you also want to keep some things in the ground. So a lot of people will let their livestock loose in the field, and maybe they'll just eat the tops, but maybe they'll pull up the whole plant. And as best as possible, if you had the time and you had the help to just cut things down to the root and just give the animals the top of the corn or the squash or whatever, instead of letting them do the whole thing, then if you leave some roots in the ground, that can help your soil. Because really what we're going for, and everybody is becoming familiar with this idea of the soil food web and the underground life in the soil and the biological health, and that's just becoming more and more prominent in discussions about gardening, about farming. How are we also working with the soil and working with nature, and not taking that Western way of kind of fighting it as we go, and make it more of a collaboration. So again, that life below, most of it's so tiny we can't even comprehend how much there is down there. But it's something that I think in the Navajo way, people used to be more connected to all life and all, not just thinking of it in such black and white terms. So as we're looking at putting the garden to bed, putting the field to bed, winding things down for this year, as we prepare for next year, it's a good idea to look at, well, what is my land like? What is my garden like? What strategies make sense to use where? And maybe I don't use just one, maybe I use a combination of them. So the latest debates in all of this, especially talking about the life in the soil, has to do with, well, till, that's the way that a lot of people do large scale farming, or no till, or no dig. And what does all of that mean? So I thought we should bring in another expert. So, confused? James Bond can help. Now, you don't believe me, but just watch. James Bond's known for his martinis, shaken, not stirred. So if you translate that to gardening, you can think of tilling is really like the shaken, not stirred. Think of it as a blender where you're just really plowing things up, you're churning things up, it's getting totally mixed into something that you might not even recognize. So that's the most disturbing, or the most action that the soil sees is when you till. Whereas no-till, you can think of it as being stirred and not shaken, where you're just lightly forking something in, maybe digging a little bit, you're aerating the soil, you might turn the soil, you might do some light tilling, but you're not really trying to go full on with the tilling. And then for no dig, it's just you're just looking really mostly at the top of the surface of the soil. You're not getting into it in a, you're just, again, putting compost on top, organic matter on top, mulches on top. You're really looking at the top layer. And so, of course, everybody's familiar with tilling. Now, the no-till method often does use a tool called a broad fork. And I found that cartoon that's on top there that has, it's in French. So it's just saying that it's easier on you to use this broad fork. So it shows the lady in the apron and the skirt or the dress just easily using the broad fork, whereas the gentleman to the right of her, behind her, is sweating, trying to shovel things. And so the idea is that you're not needing to shovel, you just are aerating the soil, adding air down there, breaking up things if it got compacted, if people were walking on it, or if something else happened and it was just, if there's a lot of clay and it's just compact together. So, and Sharon and Sadie have used the broad fork before, I know, and it's something that does take work. It's not just a easy peasy thing like the lady in the dress would make us think, but you're going down the row, you're aerating it. So you can see that picture on the left shows some very methodical, very specific, going down the row and using the broad fork. So they tend to be kind of expensive as far as a tool. It can cost anywhere from $70, $80 on up, and a really good one is often a couple $100. So it's not something everybody wants to invest in, but it is a tool that's out there. And I know there are a lot of creative people that could probably just weld up something from some other parts. But there are smaller versions. The garden fork is something that's been around for a long time, and it's just kind of like a heavy duty pitchfork as well. So it just doesn't have that same kind of platform like the broad fork does. So, but traditional planting was actually no dig, even though the stick that was used is called the digging stick. You think about how was that method achieved, and it was just taking the stick, poking one hole in one area and digging down a little bit and putting the seeds in and covering it up. You weren't aerating the soil, you were planting the seed. So it was very much a no dig approach. So that's where it gets confusing with the words, because, well, you say, but that's digging. And grandma will get out there with her shovel now, but she's just shoveling the area where the seed is going to be planted. She's digging one hole, just even maybe making one cut, one slice in there to make her hole, and then she's done. So that's no dig. And one of the reasons that that was beneficial is that squash is one of the traditional plants, and again, squash bees are not like the European honeybee. They are solitary and they dig tunnels underground. And so if you see the little holes, it's a kind of a dark photo, but there's a little hole that's below where that blossom is, and you can see other little piles of dirt, and that's where the bee is making the tunnel near the blossom, because that's their main source of nectar and pollination. So those larvae overwinter underground. And this is part of that life in the soil that we can see. It's big enough for us to know what's going on with that. And they will be down, they'll spend the whole winter down there below the ground, just 5 to 10 inches below the surface. And then they'll come out the next spring. So again, tilling versus no till versus no dig. The no dig, with just poking one hole, is gonna be least interfering to these baby squash bees that are trying to survive till spring. I thought this was a pretty photo too, and just the idea again that the beneficial mycorrhizae, that's a word that people are becoming more familiar with. It's just, there are so many little different kinds of life that live underground. And so these are getting back to the tinies, but not disturbing the soil allows them to live their life. If you figure, if every morning when you got up, your vehicle was totally taken apart and you had to put it back together again before you went anywhere, that's kind of what tilling does, or a lot of digging does, is it just really breaks things up to the point that some of these underground life forms, if they're not killed, they really have to start all over again. So if we want a healthy garden eventually, we want to really encourage that life. So the exception is if you had squash bugs, then you can't really use your dead leaves and vines in your garden as mulch. You can't leave them there. You need to clear them out, because squash bugs will overwinter in those leaves, and they'll even overwinter in buildings. I have a friend in St. Michael's, and I was visiting her one time in December, and we noticed there was a squash bug inside her house on her windowsill. And we were not impressed, but they'll find places to be. So if you had squash bugs, you really want to clear away as much from the garden as you can that they might find to make a home in. So if you clear everything out, you could potentially bring in fresh mulch and things that haven't been infested, but it's something that you're going to want to consider. How do you deal with that? How do you treat that now so that you don't have the problems next year that you had this year? So if the squash bugs survive in your garden in the wintertime, then they're going to come out again in the early summer, and you'll be back where you started. So this is one of the real exceptions why you would not always follow the practices that we suggest when we do these webinars. So the real popular method, and we have some friends that are really good at doing this, but the idea of lasagna gardening and lasagna beds. So it's something that this is a great time of year to do it, and it's what I've been doing with my garden beds here, because it's something that's easy for me, and it's easy for me to get the materials, and I'm doing it on a small scale. There are some people that do it on a larger scale, but it's not something you would want to do for a whole big old field. It is something you can do if you have a smaller garden, say one of the, what are they, 20 by 30 or 30 by 40 gardens that some people are developing. You know, these are manageable in a smaller scale. So, and with that, the idea is that you're layering just like you're making a lasagna or making a 7-layer dip. The bottom layer being cardboard, that if you can soak it down is best. And then just adding what's called greens and browns. So browns being things that are straw, leaves, shredded paper, not something fresh, whereas the greens would be vegetable scraps, fresh leaves that are still green. And then you're building that up, and then it will decrease as it starts to break down in the wintertime. And I gave another example here of planting, and if you see at the top it says 1, dig a hole, 2, fill with compost, 3, plant up, 4, water in. So if you were to wait and do this in the spring, you could actually go ahead, make your lasagna bed and plant in it right away. So you don't have to run out there and do that right now, but it's something you can think about as you're developing your garden for next year. And again, it's not that you never dig, but you're disturbing the soil as little as possible so that you're acknowledging that there are other forces that can help your garden grow. So I wanted to make sure to talk about manure, because that's something around here that's a really common available resource, especially if you can get somebody to haul it for you. A little trickier if you have to go haul it yourself. But I think I wanted to also mention it because we talk about it needs to be old and all of that. But I think that we miss talking about the part that it needs to be, if you're going to use it in the garden, it has to have been away from animals, away from any animals peeing on it, for at least 120 days before the crop is harvested. So that gives us a lot of time. So if you were to get busy this weekend and you had manure in the corral, or you'd cleaned out the corral and you had a nice big pile on the side, but it was still kind of fresh, that's fine. Because if you look at this calendar and you look through the months, you go all the way through, February 21st is 120 days from tomorrow. And I don't think there are too many people that would be planting anything in February. You're not supposed to. We're not at climate change yet to where we'd be doing it that fast. So that's a lot of time. So say you didn't get to it this weekend, you did it later, even in November, summer, you're shifting it to March. That's still the 120 days is from the time you apply the manure to the time that the plant, that the vegetable or fruit is harvested. So you're not planting seeds yet, you're not planting transplants yet, so you've got time. So this is something I think we need to emphasize more, is that this is such a great time to make use of that manure and use it to improve the life in the soil of your garden beds and in your fields, because whatever moisture we get this winter will also help get those nutrients distributed into the soil. So 120 days is from the time you apply it to your garden to the time you harvest. Now again, fresh manure will burn crops. If you put fresh manure in and you try to plant something, you want to be mindful of that. But in terms of food safety and farm food safety, they're really looking at the pathogens and the lifespan of the pathogens from the time that it comes out of the animal to the time that you're harvesting your crop. So another thing I think that we're missing when we talk about these gardening activities is the idea of using the scrap wool in a lasagna bed. So this is from the bed that I did that's on that first page of my presentation. I did do a layer that has the straw, and then I put some scrap wool on it. And the wonderful thing about the scrap wool is it's stuff that nobody's using, nobody's selling. Usually it's got manure on it, it's got bits of plants and things like that. So it's all organic materials. And if you put it lower down in the bed, it also, it's wool. It can hold water. And it's something that other people in other parts of the country and in other parts of the world are starting to use wool more and more in agriculture. And we're just not catching on yet. And I would really like to see people take advantage of this resource rather than just have these bags of wool that can't be sold. There's a lot that could be done with it to improve your garden soil and to improve your field. It's just a question of figuring out what strategy is going to work in your situation. So yeah, and reminding everybody of that soil food web, something again to be mindful of, because when we start getting to the bigger critters, that's when we start having more of a challenge. So again, in the flashback, got the Caddyshack gopher there, but I know a number of people have issues with gophers. I used to, where I live now, there aren't any yet. So not saying that I'm never going to get them, but a lot of this area does have rocks just like an inch below. So it's not their best territory, but gophers are something that it's a constant challenge to deal with when you have a garden, when you have a field. What do you do? So I'm just going to talk about them in the gardening strategies, because a field is a bigger scope, and that's something where there will be other presentations on how to deal with that more specifically. But for a small garden, for a home garden situation, it can be dealt with fairly easily. And this is one approach. The idea, a lot of people like to do raised beds. I'm not a big fan of boxes, but it's an easy way to go. So this one, I found this photo and I thought it was pretty cool, because this person also lined the bed with these feed bags, mostly dog food, chicken feed, things like that, because the person felt that that would help keep the wood from rotting any quicker, because pine and such doesn't necessarily last a long time. So this was an experiment. So again, these are the kinds of things where it's a good opportunity. It's a good way. You might have the next best great idea that other gardeners are going to say, wow, why didn't I think of that? And certainly we have feedbacks to make use of. So it's a way to line a garden bed. But really what the idea was, as far as the gophers, because they're not going to care about that part, is that mesh on the bottom. Now, this is the 1-inch chicken wire. That's not really the best thing to use if you're trying to prevent gophers, but this shows how it was applied. So years ago, when I first started thinking about this, I had looked, and the prices have gone up a little bit, but if you were going to use chicken wire, again, the planning, you want to think about how. A lot of people use it because it's not as expensive, but a 1-inch sized holes, gophers can chew through that. Sometimes they can even squeeze through that when they're small. And so it doesn't really work well for gophers. It doesn't even really work for chickens. And so it's not something that people are promoting a whole lot, but if it's what you got, you use what you got. And it is available. Sometimes it's in stock, sometimes it's not in stock. If you get online, you can have them shipped to store, and then you can go pick it up to the store, at the store when it comes in. Usually it takes a couple weeks. So it's something to think about. But really what I prefer, if I'm going to use so-called chicken wire for anything, this is the way I go, is I'll get the stucco netting. And that's not in the garden department. It's over in the concrete area, because it's used for housing and walls and such. It's not used like we use it, but it was so much nicer to use. It really works well. It's very smooth. It doesn't, when I work with chicken wire, it tends to suddenly start kinking up and bending in weird ways, and the stucco netting doesn't do that. So, and it's also, for the price, that's 150 feet for $70, as opposed to this one was $33 for 50 feet. So $99 versus $71. So you're saving $20-30 by getting this instead. So if you're gonna go with chicken wire, go with this product, and then you can overlap it, and maybe weave it together with wire or something like that to make it more gopher proof. So this isn't something that I like to use for some things. And it's also good for protecting fruit trees against rabbits and such, if you want to wrap it around the trunk or something. But then hardware cloth, it's, who knows how it got that name, but hardware cloth is a great thing to use against gophers because it's smaller. It's only 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch. It's not something that they can squeeze through, and it takes quite a while before they can chew through it. So again, just trying to price it out. Here nearby in Gallup, it's something that sometimes is in stock, and at Home Depot and also Tractor Supply. Sometimes it's in stock. It kind of comes and goes, but it's also pricey. So it's something you really, really want to decide if that's what you want to use. So another alternative that I discovered, again, in that concrete section of the store, is the idea of this steel lath. And it's small weave, it's sharp, so it definitely gopher proof, and it comes in these sheets. So when I've purchased it in the past, they've rolled it up for me. It's best to have gloves because you could cut yourself on this. I've used it around fencing to try to keep rabbits coming into, from squeezing into the bottom of a fence. So there's a lot of different ways you can use it, but it is, again, for the price, it's a really good material to use, and the holes are so small and sharp that a lot of rodents are not going to want to try to mess with it until later on down the line when it starts to rust. So it's definitely something to consider. So this is just an example of somebody that was putting it together in their raised bed, and keeping in mind that you do want to fold the edges up. If you do, you also want to staple them down. You want to hammer them down with some fencing nails or other things, because gophers will squeeze through things. They'll be very creative about it. So, and then you also want to not just have loose edges, you want to weigh those down and even wire them together as best you can. So there's a lot of front end work that can be done. And that's something, again, this is a good time to do it. It's a transition time. So rather than in the spring when things might be getting busy and crazy and windy and everything else, you can take some time and really think about doing these things. So if you're going to do the boxes, I always advocate doing some color, making it more fun. So that's why I included this just as a reminder for that. But also look at different shapes, because again, raised beds, a lot of people like to work with them for a lot of different reasons. But I do get tired of seeing the boxes, and I know we have a lot of talent and creativity that's just not, people aren't translating it into their garden spaces yet, and I would love to see that happen more and more. So, because otherwise, at least, this looks kind of like a flower if you think about if you were a bird up above it looking down, whereas the straight boxes can look more like, I don't know. So this is the straight boxes, and that's a little bit better because they're spread out again, kind of like a flower. But if you just keep them lined up in a row, then it starts to look sort of like a cemetery to me, and I don't think that's a really positive vibe. So turn them on their sides, make them into T's, make them into L shapes, do something else to make it more interesting. But that's just my personal thing. And then you can also do the lasagna in a container. So if you got a big trough or something, or even in smaller pots, but too small, it's not worth the effort. But again, something to think about in terms of building your soil without going out and buying a lot of soil. Right now, they were already setting up at Home Depot and Gallup to setting up their pallets for Christmas trees, which I thought was crazy. But so there's really very little soil that you can easily purchase. And again, it's not something that people want to spend a lot of money on. But if you take your manure, take your old hay, straw, pine needles, wool, vegetable scraps, all kinds of things that you could use. You can put, if you're putting it on top of rocks or a really rocky part of your land, you can put some twigs at the bottom too to help with the drainage of everything. So again, it's a really good approach, and a lot of people have been using it successfully in different places on the res. So eventually there'll be more demonstration gardens with those in them. But this is another idea that to consider. This was done years ago at St. Michael's Association for Special Education in St. Michael's, Arizona. But this was meant to be a spiral garden. And so it's using the cattle panels and the T-posts to make a trellis area that you can walk into. So we had measured everything to be 5 feet apart so that you could easily get a wheelchair in there. And so this is earlier on where we don't have the wood chips down for the pathway part of it yet. But all we were planting is we planted tomatoes just in that area, and you can barely tell, but we did build up the soil underneath the cattle panels. So the cattle panels are a few inches off the ground, and then there's a hill of soil that runs around all the way around in that spiral. And that was the only area that we amended, that we used manure, we used compost underneath there, so you could do a little built up from the ground lasagna area and then pile your regular native soil on top of that. And this is a really fun thing, and I will get one going at my house here eventually. It's just I have to clear the area where it's going to go, and that hasn't happened yet. But again, a raised bed doesn't have to be a box. It can just be an area where the soil is higher. And the tomatoes did great. I don't have an after picture of that. But other considerations that I didn't want to forget about before we got to the end of our discussion here, but water. This is the time now to think about what can I do for next year to make it easier. So I have my rain barrels started, but they're not in place yet because I still have to fix gutters and even install gutters, and I have to set up an irrigation system. So I'm having to haul water and water things by hand and all of that. But that's work, and especially in these times when there's so many other things that our priorities. So we want to look at growing food is also a priority. How do we make that easier? And how do we be more efficient with that process? So we really, now is a really good time to think about what can I do to make it easier next season to water things, because that life in the soil needs water too. It's not just the plants, it's all those little critters. So another thing that now is a good time to think about when it's not as windy, how are you protecting things from the wind? We have such strong wind in the spring, and it felt like this year, this past summer, it just kept going and going and going and going, and we didn't have as much of a break from the windy weather. And that's hard on the plants too. So if you want to have a garden, if you want to have things like strawberries, how are you going to protect them? I found this photo. I thought this was kind of funny. And they took straw bales and just basically made a big box for their garden. But those straw bales are meant to be windbreaks for there's little pepper plants right next to them on the left side. There's also some probably squash plants, maybe melons over on the other side, and then tomatoes down the middle. And then they've also built a big old fence to go up the sides and over. So they're protecting their garden from birds, from probably deer, who knows what else. So yeah, now is a good time to do that kind of work, because that is work. But once it's set up, then it makes everything so much easier, and you're not fighting against the critters so much. This is just a reminder of ways to use wool. So wool can also be used as a mulch. I haven't done that much here because it is something that the dogs like to play with. So, and I don't have them fenced off from my garden areas. So, but it's something that other parts of the world, people are experimenting with it and have been very successful with certain things. So I just wanted to remind people about that possibility. And again, you don't have to get fancy with your garden design, but sketch some things out on paper. Think of some ideas. What do you want to do? What did I do? Where did I put it? What do I want to do? So as we're putting the garden to bed, that one has got a lot of flowers in it, but don't think about your errors or failures. Otherwise, you'll never do a thing. But overall, gardening is medicine. It doesn't need a prescription, has no limit on dosage. And right now, with all that is going on, gardening has become important on so many levels. Farming has become important on so many levels. And not just because we need the food, because clearly everybody that planted a garden this year didn't have 100% success. Things died, things got eaten by critters, things got hailed on, or they got frozen or stepped on, or who knows what. All kinds of things can happen to your garden. But it's therapeutic. It's good for our souls. It connects us to the earth. It connects us to the land. It connects us to our food. It helps us appreciate where this food is coming from. So those are the kinds of things that I don't think we can even put a price on, and so valuable in these times. So yeah, thank you. I appreciate again this time, and I don't know if we have any questions or anything from our group. So does anybody have any other thoughts or suggestions or comments?
Carole, this is Sharon. Thank you for this presentation. It was so informative. For the windbreaks, for the strong winds and all, I think you saw what I've been using, that shade
Yes.
cloth. Yeah, that really helped my plants when that strong wind came along with the hot heat. My Swiss chard almost dried out, and so did some of the tomato plants. But once I got that shade cloth put on, as soon as I noticed the wind was strong and it was like around like 89 degrees. So once I got that put up, it saved a lot of the tomato plants and a few of the Swiss chard.
Absolutely. And that's the kind of thing I thought because, as we all could probably go on for hours and hours about some of these topics, but I thought, that's something that probably it's its own webinar that you guys will have scheduled sometime over the course of the next couple of months, windbreaks, because I thought that was a really great strategy.
Anyone else have a question?
I have a question. This is Jessie.
Go ahead, Jessie.
Okay, so Carole, when you put the manure, as far as composting, would you recommend tilling the manure into the future garden site and letting it rest? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the whole tilling thing, it just becomes this weird controversy. But I think if the garden, especially if the garden has never been worked, or if it just, if it feels like the soil is too dense and compacted and clay, then now is a great time to till it in if it's available, because the winter moisture will help make everything meld together, sort of like baking a cake or whatever. When you add the liquid to the flour and all that to make the dough, then it just all becomes one unit instead of being individual things. I know that's not a good analogy, but you know what I'm saying. But I think, especially for the manure, because a lot of the things, the thing that is, I think, the biggest challenge when we have these discussions and we do these webinars is that there's so much information out there that is from other parts of the country and other parts of the world where they have a lot of rain, they have a lot of moisture, and we just don't have that. I think this year at my house, I don't know that I've even barely got 5 inches because I have a little rain gauge and I've been trying to keep track. And this whole year has been so dry. So it's the moisture that makes a difference with compost and with the soil and all of that. And so our soil is dry and it's high in minerals. And so that organic matter, tilling in that organic matter, even in the short term, if it's disruptive, it can make a real difference for the long-term health of the soil. So I never say don't till, and especially with manure, especially with a big area, that's a lot of times that's the best strategy to get things going.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Carole. And that was a very good presentation. I learned a lot.
Oh, good. I'm glad you enjoyed it. It's hard, some of these topics, because again, now there is so much information out there, and I feel like some of this, we're sort of, those of us that do this, we've heard it a lot, and so it's hard to know, well, what can we say that people haven't already heard 300 times?
Well, I appreciate your presentation, Carole. I thought it was very informational, and all the topics that you covered were all things that, we all have been encountering here. Even for me, I tried gardening, but due to the freeze and then of course COVID, we weren't very successful. However, it shouldn't stop us, and like you had indicated, it's very therapeutic. So I encourage everyone to continue gardening, and I want to thank also everyone for joining us today. Our contact information for Arizona Native American Producer Success Project 7. I'm Sadie Lister. And I'm the field coordinator. You may reach me at 928-637-5633. And then the assistant field coordinator, Sharon Sandman, I work with her. Her cell number is 505-427-4262. We also have a couple of colleagues in the New Mexico Native American Producer Success Project 6, and that's Jenna Johnson and Jesse Jim. You may reach them as well. They put on also a lot of webinars just as we do, and I don't have their phone numbers readily available, but you may contact me, and if you need to get a hold of them, by all means, I will share the information with them. We welcome your comments so that we may provide resources of interest to better farming and ranching methods. We also want to continue, we will also continue hosting webinars, posting information on Facebook relating to upcoming events, including monthly newsletters, videos, USDA resources, links, and then our recorded webinars are put into a video format, so those are shared as well. So look us up. We are at Arizona NAPS 7 in the blue, and we are working on a website, so that's coming soon. We're getting close to opening that website. So this is things that we're doing to continue our project as we move along. And again, I want to thank everyone for joining us. You all have a wonderful afternoon, and wear your face mask, wash your hands, social distancing, and don't forget to vote. Thanks, guys. This concludes our
Thank
webinar
you.
for today. Agone.